Hello, and thank you for joining me. So, I have been making a series of videos on the RMS Titanic sinking, and within the past fortnight alone, I've discovered a lot of things that I didn't previously know. So, I've been in a bit of a role with research and just looking up various information. Certainly, a lot of things that I wasn't aware of previously. Anyway, about 2 years ago, I uploaded a video on Bruce Ismay. And I felt then, and I still feel that Ismay, to some extent, has been unfairly scapegoated as an individual for the Titanic disaster. Ismay certainly made some grave mistakes, and he's certainly done some questionable things, but I still feel that there has been something of a character assassination in terms of how Hollywood has presented him. But in that video, one of my subscribers, Terry Bay, asked about whether I would make a video on Stanley Lord. Now, Stanley Lord was the captain of the SS Californian, and at the time I was reluctant to make a video because I didn't feel I had enough information to go on. But I feel this is a good subject and there is a lot to talk about. I still don't know all the details, so for that reason, I'm not going to make a very comprehensive video. But to Terry, thank you for the suggestion. I think it is definitely an interesting subject. So what I'm going to do in this video is discuss the very intriguing idea about whether or not the Titanic could have actually survived, even with hitting the iceberg. And there's a lot of things to consider. So I'm only going to scrape the surface here, but I'm going to try and lay out some of the main issues. I'm going to divide this into the the sort of situation that the SS Californian was in that night and the response of Captain Lord, also the Titanic itself and some of the actions of the leading Titanic crew members. And like I say, this is really only scratching the surface. One thing about the Titanic, and I think this is important, because it is such a famous event, because it's such a almost certainly the most famous shipwreck in history, there is so many different intrigues, so many different testimonies. I think it's going to endure forever. I think there's going to be conflicting testimonies forever. Of course, all the survivors are now have now passed away. The last survivor, Milvina Dean, was only a baby when the sinking happened. She passed away in 2009. I believe Eva Hart was the last survivor who could remember anything. But the testimonies that are available are themselves somewhat contradictory. That's what makes it so difficult to have consistency in terms of what we really know about that night. But there are some things that have been repeated in several pieces of testimony. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to talk about some of the main things. I think one thing that is very, very important is to understand the conditions of the night. Um, every every crew member of all the ships that were on the North Atlantic in that sort of region at the time testified that the water was as still as a mill pond. Now, this is very important because we now know that this is an indicator of pack ice. So the water was so calm that it would have been almost impossible for the crew of any ship to be able to see the water breaking against ice. In other words, if you're looking in the distance, if you're looking on the horizon, it would be impossible to see where the water surface ended and where the night sky began. And as I understand it, it was a moonless night, so that made it even more difficult. Another problem that the Titanic had was lookout binoculars were apparently missing because one, Mr. Blair, had mixed them up in Southampton, not deliberately, of course, but um, by mistake. So that again may be one of many situations that led to the fate of the Titanic, although there's no indication that binoculars would have made a great deal of difference in the sort of conditions anyway. I always find that aspect quite sinister, the fact this was as still as a mill pond. I find the idea that the crew members not being able to see the surface water, I find that quite chilling, to be honest. Of all the intrigues of that night, I find that one of the most sinister. So, the information I should say that I'm going on is Wikipedia. Granted, probably not the best source, but it is one of the most freely available. So, okay, so Stanley Lord, he was the captain of the SS Californian. Now, I had always known of the Californian and of the Carpathian. Of course, it's well documented that the Carpathian was further away, but under Captain Rostron had rushed immediately to help the Titanic, but was further away, 4 hours away, which was, of course, too late. Now, the Californian has sort of been presented as the villain. It's very difficult to tell if this is a fair portrayal or not. Um, One thing that happened after the Titanic struck the iceberg, it took 25 minutes for Captain Smith to give the order for the lifeboat maneuvering to take place and for passengers to be mustered. It's well documented, of course, that there wasn't enough lifeboats. The Titanic actually met the regulations. So, this is the irony: the Titanic wasn't actually breaking the regulations of the time. It was felt that at the time, not quite that the Titanic was unsinkable. That was something that the tabloids sort of fueled, but rather that the engineering of ships at this time had went beyond needing so many lifeboats. Captain Smith himself said at an inquiry in 1907 that he felt that ships could maintain this. Now, there was a incident in 1907, and I've only literally found this out in the last half hour. In 1907, the SS Kronprinz Wilhelm, which was a much smaller liner than the Titanic, a German liner, had rammed an iceberg and suffered a crushed bow, but was still able to complete her voyage. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find much more information on that, but the same year, Captain Smith declared in an interview that he could not imagine a situation, a condition, which would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding had gone beyond that. Now, I'll come back to the exact circumstances of how the Titanic hit the iceberg. I think that is very important. But to stick with Captain Lord and the Californian, Lord had apparently told his crew and his wireless operators that night it was 20-year-old Cyril Evans, only 20 years old, to send out ice warnings to the other ships in the vicinity, one of which, of course, was the Titanic. In fact, in total, there was about 5 ships in the vicinity. They were the Titanic, of course, the Californian, the Carpathian, the Frankfurt, the SS Mount Temple, and the RMS Olympic. That's news to me. Only in the last week did I find out that the Olympic was actually in the North Atlantic the same night as the Titanic. I hadn't realized that. I kind of naively took the idea that they took turns in the transatlantic voyages. So it's only recently I found out that the Olympic was also in the region. However, the Olympic was by far the furthest away. Um, I don't know the exact distance, but certainly far further away than the other liners. The second furthest away was the Frankfurt. Um, the Carpathia was further away than the Californian, and so was the SS Mount Temple. So the Californian was the closest liner. Now, this is something very, very important. Cyril Evans, who was the sole wireless operator of the Californian, bear in mind the Californian was a much smaller liner than the Titanic, so they didn't have 24-hour wireless operating. Um, I feel that the exchange between Cyril Evans and Jack Phillips of the Titanic was critical. Jack Phillips and his junior wireless operator Harold Bride had found that their wireless system had a malfunction earlier in the day, and they'd spent the whole day, the 14th of April, trying to fix this. Now, they found that they had to deal with a backlog of first class passengers' personal messages to Cape Race, which was the station in Newfoundland, which handled this sort of wireless first class mail. So these were basically personal messages to family, to loved ones. Every film version has covered this. Now, when Evans was told to warn other ships of pack ice, he done precisely that. When he informed the Titanic, when he informed Jack Phillips, apparently the Californian was so close in maritime terms that the message actually deafened Phillips. And because he was working under pressure, he was dealing with a backlog. Um, his message to Evans was, "Keep out, shut up, I am busy, and working Cape Race. I'm working Cape Race." Um, and Phillips never passed this message to the bridge. Um, Now, in Phillips' defense, Evans had not prefixed a message about the ice field with the letters MSG, which stood for Master Servicegram, and as I understand it, this was the customary message intended for the bridge of a ship. Um, However, it's quite clear that Phillips also made a mistake in not taking this ice warning seriously from Evans. The problem is, Phillips was one of the fatalities of the Titanic. I feel that because of the sort of code of honor of the time, those who perished received no blame whatsoever. I feel that both Smith and Phillips did make some mistakes. Phillips clearly didn't take the ice warning seriously. He clearly prioritized this backlog. Now, to be fair to Phillips, he was probably under huge pressure to do so. He was dealing with some of the richest people in the world at the time, and he was probably under a sort of code of conduct to have to deal with this. Um, Evans shortly afterwards went to sleep because, like I say, the California didn't have 24-hour coverage. Now, Evans felt that he had done everything he was supposed to do, and according to Wikipedia, Evans, feeling that he had done what was asked of him despite Phillips' rude rejection of the message, then switched off his wireless equipment and went to bed. This exchange was to prove serious. Now, those crew members on the Californian who were awake, presumably on deck, did actually see the Titanic's firework warnings. However, there was a lot of confusion over whether these were in fact fireworks. Um, One question that Terry Bay asked me was about the stance of Captain Lord. Now, one thing I am adamant about, and this goes for pretty much everyone involved in the disaster, I do not believe that Captain Lord deliberately ignored the Titanic as it was sinking. I believe there was genuine confusion. However, Captain Lord certainly behaved in certain ways that are difficult to explain. Um, Both the American and British inquiries found that Captain Lord had behaved in an inappropriate manner. He gave a lengthy testimony. I'm not going to read out the whole testimony because it is quite long, but this is what had happened subsequently. Lord was dismissed by the Leyland Line in August of the same year. So far as any negligence of the SS Californian's officers and crew was concerned, the conclusions of both the American and British inquiries seemed to disapprove of Lord's actions, but stopped short of recommending charges. Both inquiries censured Lord, but they did not make any recommendation for an official investigation to ascertain whether he was guilty of negligence. It's very difficult to say whether he was guilty of negligence. And from what I understand, after Bruce Ismay, Captain Lord may have been the next most vilified um, sort of prominent figure involved in the Titanic disaster because he was widely seen as the captain who ignored the Titanic. I think to some extent this may be unfair. However, there is certainly some character testimonies that would raise certain question marks. And this is from maritime historian Daniel Allen Butler in his 2009 book, The Other Side of Night, The Carpathia, the Californian, and the Night Titanic Was Lost. Excuse me, I was saying California, Californian, the demonym Californian. Makes a case that Lord's personality and temperament, his behaviour at both inquiries, his threats towards his crew, that's something that certainly needs to be looked at more. His frequent changing of his story, the absence of the scrapbook. Apparently, the scrapbook on the Californian was destroyed, although this was the standard procedure after a voyage. The absence of the scrapbook, and odd remarks made by Lord in Boston in the newspaper interview. Um, I don't know what that's about. Point to Lord's having some sort of mental illness. His lack of compassion, never once expressing grief at the loss of the Titanic or sorrow for those who had lost family when she sank, is, according to Butler, compatible with sociopathy. He died in 1962, aged 84, and was buried in Wallasey in Merseyside. Now, it's understandable that Lord would want to clear his name. In terms of being sociopathic, in terms of having a lack of empathy, I don't know, that's what Butler says, but apparently the Californian did arrive at the scene, albeit too late, and tried to assist. Of course, by that point, the Carpathia informed them that there was nothing more they could have done. Apparently, all the ships in the vicinity had offered assistance by that point. The Olympic even offered assistance, but was informed that it would have been a waste of time. So, was Lord culpable? Very hard to know. I think it's one of these things that the Titanic is really something that cannot be blamed on any individual. Now, to get back to the Titanic itself, they had they had sent the distress warnings not immediately. It's important to understand that had the Titanic struck the iceberg head on, the general consensus today is that there would have been serious damage, but it may just have been possible that the ship would have stayed afloat longer than it did. The Titanic took about 2 hours to sink. Now, it's very difficult to know how long it would have sank if it struck the iceberg dead on. But at this point, there may have been serious mistakes made. And there's actually a diagram on Wikipedia in the article about the sinking of the ship that shows the actual direction that the ship took. So the iceberg struck the ship, and contrary to popular opinion, it did not strike a long gash in the ship's hull, but rather punctured the rivets. So it actually damaged the hull work, but it wasn't like you have a sardine can or a sardine tin and you slice it open. It was more like it damaged the hull and then damaged the rivet plating. And what's very significant is that Murdoch's order, when Frederick Fleet passed on the message to the deck to First Officer Murdoch, Murdoch then made the order to port around. That is to say that the ship tried to move around the iceberg rather than going ahead at the usual course. Of course, the side effect of this was that it then led to the iceberg denting the hull even more. I have to be careful here into getting into technical terms. I'm not an engineer, but it seems to me that there was a lot of procrastination. It was a full 25 minutes. The Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40. Smith only ordered the first evacuations at 12:05, a full 25 minutes. And as I understand it, it wasn't until 11:56 that the Titanic actually came to halt. I need to double check that, but it was certainly not immediate. So the Titanic traveled for some distance. Was this a good idea or not? It's very difficult to know. Could the Titanic have survived under its own steam? In other words, had the Titanic not stopped at all, could it have kept going to the nearest port, which I believe would have been either St. John's in Newfoundland or Halifax in Nova Scotia? Could it have survived? Well, looking at that earlier German incident and also another earlier incident involving the Olympic. The Olympic was involved in the collision with the Hawk, which was a smaller tramp steamer in 1911. Big difference, though. Incidentally, the Olympic survived that and went back to port on its own steam. Big difference is that was off the coast of the Isle of Wight, which was, of course, much closer to the British mainland. The Titanic was 640 kilometers from the nearest port. there is a real possibility that had the wireless communications been better, had there been more consistency between the communication, it is quite possible, I feel, had the Titanic struck the iceberg head on, certainly there would have been damage. There may even have been a few deaths from those in the hold areas because they may have been crushed or suffered a heart attack or who knows. But it is quite possible that smaller vessels could have almost acted like tugboats. I mean, this is completely a theory. It's important to remember this was unprecedented. This sort of disaster was unprecedented. Um, but I would basically conclude that there was, it's difficult to blame any individual. It's important to remember that Captain Smith was seen as an exemplary sea captain, 40 years of experience, held in high regard, but I do feel he had been a bit slow to act on the night. Um, but then again, who am I to judge? There is so much different information going around about what exactly happened that night in those 25 minutes that it's very, very difficult to condemn anyone. In terms of Captain Lord, to be fair to the Californian, I don't think it's a case that they ignored distress signals. I think it's a case that they genuinely didn't realize that they were distress signals. So they felt that this could have been a flickering of the stars on the masthead of the Titanic. It's very, very difficult to believe that had they seen a distress warning, they would have ignored it out of sheer callousness. If Lord had indeed been suffering from some sort of mental health problems, that's quite a statement to make. But if that is true, that might explain why the Californian acted the way it did. But the truth is, we will never know for certain. What I would conclude with is I don't think it's fair to blame any individual. I think the fate of the Titanic lies with collective responsibility. Definitely, there was negligence on the part of the White Star Line, and Ismay has to take some responsibility for that, as he had fought against having more lifeboats on board. His attitude was, "We've met the regulations. It's enough as it is." Could the Titanic have survived? 640 kilometers from the nearest port. It's very difficult to know. Could more people have survived? It is quite possible the Titanic could have foundered, but more people would have been saved had the Californian been closer. In fact, had all the ships in the vicinity reached the Titanic much earlier, it's possible. Now, by contrast, Captain Rostron of the Carpathia was treated as a hero because, of course, he was the captain who saved as many passengers as possible, um, which was still a minority of those who perished. But let me know your thoughts. This has been a longer video, but there's been a lot of issues to cover. Apologies for the lack of technical terms that I've been using here. I'm just a layman when it comes to engineering and maritime engineering in particular. But it's definitely interesting. Um, I think there's a lot of interesting aspects of this. There is, of course, the theory that there was a fire in the Titanic's hold. That is a theory that has really been promoted as of 2017. If that is true, if there is I mean, there has actually been older accounts of a fire being on board, but only this year has it really been given a lot of weight. Now, that's very important because it could well have weakened the hull of the Titanic. Um, did Murdoch make a major mistake by ordering the maneuver of the ship? One thing that's very important, remember we're talking about a 46,000 ton object. It's a bit like if you're in a speeding car, you suddenly put on the brake, the car isn't going to stop immediately. Same principle with a ship. And the Titanic is obviously going to travel for some distance. I don't know how far from the iceberg the Titanic was when it sent the CQD message, but I would imagine probably several miles. It's also important to remember that the actual location of the wreck is some distance away from where the CQD message was sent. But this could be explained by the fact that, such a heavy object going down to the seabed. Also, apparently the conditions were very calm on the night, but there was a storm the night afterwards. So there is a lot of things to look at. because apparently the conditions of the Carpathia before they arrived in New York City were horrendous. There was stormy weather. It was actually so the night the Titanic sank was the last calm night, ironically. Had it been one night later, had it been the 16th of April, the stormy weather, presumably the water would have hit the bergs, and that would have presented a much clearer situation for the lookouts. But there's so many things to look at. I've only scratched the surface with this video, and this has been a long video. So let me know your thoughts. Terry Bay, let me know your thoughts. And thank you for watching.